Lynne McNeill holds her doctorate in folklore from Memorial University of Newfoundland and currently teaches folklore and composition courses both online and face-to-face at Utah State University. She taught her first hybrid online course in 1999, and the study of digital culture has been a focus of her research since 2003. She has published book chapters and journal articles on a wide variety of subjects, has appeared as a judge on the Food Network, and is currently at work on a Folklore Studies textbook. Lynne, are you there and ready to begin? I know you're having bad weather where you are.
Yes, I'm here, and hopefully no tornadoes will touch down while speaking. All right, are we ready to begin?
I think so.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, welcome, everyone. I'm glad you can be here today. Should there be any technical difficulties, you should know that I'm in Florida right now, which is one of the benefits of teaching online. I get to be in Florida instead of Utah in March, but I also get the risk of tornadoes. So if I suddenly disappear, you can assume that the building I'm in has been swept away. As Amy said, I teach composition, and I'm also a folklorist, and it's in a merging of those two capacities that I'm here to talk to everyone today about some strategies for making the most of an online composition class experience. Clearly, as you're all familiar with, much of the skill of teaching composition in general translates quite well from a face-to-face setting to an online setting. But there are also some obstacles that need to be overcome, and the obstacles I'm talking about go beyond learning the technology and deal more with the culture of an online classroom. One of the biggest obstacles in an online class, especially in an entire online class rather than a hybrid, and that's mostly what I'm going to be addressing today, is overcoming the perceived distance between you and your students. The phrase that I've used in my title, bowling alone, originated in 1995 with an article by a Harvard professor of public policy named Robert Putnam, in which he illustrated and decried the increasing social disengagement that he perceived in American society. And one of the things that he cited as evidence of the deterioration of social networks was that while more people than ever before are bowling, there are fewer bowling leagues. Now, Putnam's work has since been published as an entire book, and it's been quite controversial throughout. But his phrase, bowling alone, is really useful in that it's become emblematic of the fears and the concerns that we have about increasing social isolation in contemporary society. And online classes, as a component of online interaction in general, are one of the examples of the kinds of things that worries people when they consider contemporary mediated communication. There is a very popular and pervasive perception that technologically mediated communication leads to social impoverishment, disengagement, general degradation of our society. This is something that we hear people say a lot in general. I'm sure you've heard people say it too, things like young people don't know how to have a conversation anymore because they're constantly texting on their phones or chatting online. And we hear the same criticism leveled easily and handily against online classes as well. Things like, I just don't think you can really learn without being in a class with other students, or I don't think you can really learn from a website, things like this. And it sounds like it's a new idea since this concern is being applied to new technology, but it's actually a really long-standing one. And I want you to consider this quote. I won't read the entire thing. You can read it for yourselves, but I want to draw your attention to some of the key points included in this warning about technology, that this invention will create forgetfulness. People will be hearers of many things and will have learned nothing. They will appear omniscient and will generally know nothing. They will have the show of wisdom without the reality. Now, I love showing this quote to my students because the first time I heard it, and a lot of them think the same thing too, I thought immediately of Wikipedia and the way that with the internet and mobile internet on our cell phones, we can almost instantaneously get information on any topic. I've had fellow instructors and teachers talk about a student who asks a question about something they don't know, and during a break in lecturing, they run to their phone and look it up real quick and get the answer. And, questionable though that information may be, it enables people to sound as if we know something about a topic that we've not studied or learned thoroughly in any way. So we really do have that show of wisdom. But this quote that we have here is talking about a much, much earlier communications technology, which is the written alphabet. And let me see if I can get to the next slide. There we are. This quote is quoted by Plato, but from Socrates, who definitely believed that by writing down our knowledge, using just that level of mediation, writing it down rather than passing it on orally person to person, we were threatening our knowledge, our intelligence, the quality of our learning, the quality of our understanding. And since the alphabet, from the alphabet to Wikipedia, almost all new media technologies, that's the telegraph, the telephone, the television, everything, have faced similar criticism. But as time has shown, we've managed to both adapt those technologies and adapt to them and still really retain our genuine functioning person-to-person relationship. So at this point in history, we may not have completely mastered the latest incarnation of mediated communication, but there's absolutely no reason to assume that we won't, and that there won't be ways to overcome the limitations that technology puts, in our cases, on our relationships with our students. So there are many, many ways to create a really good, engaging environment in an online classroom. And some of them are very basic and deal with the construction of the classroom. Others are more theoretical and deal with your approach to your students and the virtual space that you share. Since we have limited time here, but since we also have people who I'm sure have widely varying backgrounds in online teaching, I want to try and touch briefly on both of those aspects, starting with the basic setup and design questions that address the unique space of an online classroom. So organizationally, when you are setting up an online space to share with your students, you have to try and see things the way that your students are seeing them. If you're teaching an entirely online course where your students will never meet each other, nor you in person, you need to be aware that your perception of the class as a semester-long, purposefully designed entity populated with 20-something students, that is not what your students perceive when they enter it at first. As far as they know, they're bowling alone. They interact with this online space in a solitary, isolated manner. And they have no sense initially of the bowling league that you have put together for them with this space. So rather than assuming that an online classroom speaks for itself, you want to design it so that it speaks for you and engages your students appropriately for the ways in which they're going to be perceiving this community space. So there are two levels of information that need to be readily available to students, and we'll talk about why in a minute, from their initial login. And the first is background information. And this is information that's available in full from the beginning of the semester and that stays the same throughout. So things like the syllabus, the overall calendar of the semester, your contact information, class guidelines, how the class works, things like that, and metered information. This is information that gets delivered in segments, doled out over the course of the semester. So that can be weekly, bi-weekly, tri-weekly, however you've organized your class. This is information that builds on itself as the semester goes along. So things like homework assignments, weekly discussions, your lectures, readings, etc. So there's a real clear user distinction between one-time delivery info and ongoing delivery info. And both of these elements need to be obvious and differentiated. So there should be a clearly marked central begin here place that gives students all the background information they need, which should include where to go each subsequent login for metered information. Now, there's an important thing to remember here, which is that redundancy is good, but scatter isn't. And so again, we need to be seeing these things from our students' perspective. Let's say that you, as an instructor of an online composition course, send out an orientation email with information about how the class works. And you also create a begin here link in your classroom with the same information because you can't be sure which of those two inroads any given student is going to apprehend first. So that redundancy is good. Students now have double the chances to get the information they need. But it also risks scatter. One of the most stressful experiences that online students regularly report is not being sure that they're finding all the information they need or that their class has to offer. So for a student who both receives the email and reads the Begin Here link, you want to make sure that you state in both of those places that the information is the same as in the other. Something like, if you received my welcome email, then you already know this is how the class works. Or if you visited the online classroom and followed the Begin Here link, then you know this information. Students are surprisingly not bothered by repetition as long as it's clearly labeled as repetition. Students, honestly, are just relieved to have it confirmed that they're getting the same information twice, rather than worrying that they're getting additional, possibly different information. And within the classroom in general, as many cues as can be given about where the central hub of information is located is good. And that can be a begin here or a start here, whatever you want to call it. You want to funnel students' attention at every turn toward that central hub. Today's students, they like to learn by exploring. And if any of you have, done any reading or learning about digital natives, that's actually touted as one of the defining qualities of young people who are native to digital culture, is that they learn by doing rather than by reading a manual beforehand or going through a step-by-step instruction list. I once had a student, just as an example, who completely bypassed the giant course content link on the homepage of our online classroom and went straight to the link that, for whatever reason, he perceived to be first in our classroom, which was the discussion forums. And, well, he found discussion assignments there and happily went about doing them for the first 3 weeks of class, all the while completely missing out on my audio lectures and lecture notes and reading assignments. And while we can quite rightfully call this student clueless, I mean, who assumes that there's nothing but a discussion forum to an online class, his experience does make a good point. He explored, he found information, and followed what it told him to do. And so I learned from that experience 2 things. One, make sure I have something that indicates itself as a starting point on the homepage. And starting point needs to be really pretty explicit. Begin here, start here, not simply course content. And 2, and this is really the key point that I want to be making, each area of the online classroom, especially during the first week, clearly needs to state, if you found this forum or this calendar or this assessment before you visited the Begin Here link, go back and check it out. And again, I want to emphasize, these students are here alone. They can't look left or right to see what their classmates are doing or what page everyone else turned to. And it's this lack of visual group awareness that's incredibly important. And this is actually one of the major obstacles that we find in all virtual communication. And for us, it's going to affect the design of our classroom. A physical classroom provides students with a wealth of social cues that go very far beyond a student listening to the purposeful announcements and lectures made by an instructor. For example, imagine a student sitting in the classroom, daydreaming, zoning out, looking out the window. That student who's not paying attention is going to notice peripherally when all his or her classmates suddenly sit up straighter or reach for their bags to take their pens out. And so that student will tune back in accordingly and find out about the new due date that they would have missed out on if they hadn't tuned back in. And social cues like this are an enormous part of many people's comprehension of any social situation. And that's what's mostly absent in an online classroom. And in the first week of an online classroom, before any interactive aspects of the class have begun, it's entirely absent. So as instructors, it becomes our job to create these cues for our students so that wherever they glance, they get an indication of where they're supposed to be going first and what they're supposed to be doing, directing and redirecting their attention wherever it may wander. So design aside, it's also important of course, to let your students know that you are a real person and not just an online textbook from which they receive weekly messages. And this brings us to this second half, talking about the organization of the classroom, the much more important but much perhaps less tangible aspect of engaging students deals with this realm of social engagement that we want to have with our students. And it's equally important for them to see each other as real people, as it is for them to see us as real people, because, of course, in a composition class, they're going to be working together, workshopping, and peer reviewing each other's writing. And, you know, there's a reason that flaming is prevalent on the internet. And flaming, if you're not familiar with the term, means excessively nasty and aggressive comments. And if you've ever spent any time in chat rooms or internet forums, you've probably experienced it. It's not only prevalent on the internet, it's prevalent in online classes. I talk with my students a lot about their online class experiences, and I have heard incredible horror stories about that. And there is nothing like antisocial, aggressive online interaction that really will destroy a community of writers. Even though it's an online class, you think, oh, that would never happen, students would never behave that way. You would be surprised. I've had students send me screen captures of the discussions that are happening in their classes, and it's a little bit frightening. So here is where we really start to see the deeper implications of bowling alone, this concept of social isolation and disengagement for online education. Beyond questions of design or even comprehension or orientation, providing your students with a sense of social presence is a major factor in increasing student engagement. And social presence is understood to be a feeling of interpersonal contact or immediacy that people have when they're in the physical presence of others. And the things that give us this sense of social presence are what we can generally call social cues. And so these include things like gestures, facial expressions, stance, the communication of attitude through posture, things like voice, and that can be tone and volume and pacing, and even things like clothing and style, gender, race, appearance, all of these things. Now, this last category is often one that's brought up when people are championing the equality that can be found through anonymous virtual communication, the idea that on the internet or online people can communicate without the bias or without the burden of gender, class, race, physical disability, things like this. So that is often seen as a very positive component of mediated communication. But on the other hand, these are the ways in which we form concepts of other people as unique individuals. People who flame other people online would often never say the same words to someone whose face they could see or whose body language they could read. So it is a major concern for anyone who does a lot of interaction online that a limitation of social cues can lead to this disregard for other people, or that a lack of intimacy and co-presence really does open the door for people to disengage and become socially isolated. So when we talk about mediated communication, filtering out those social cues and that concept of social presence, what we're really losing is that sense of people as people. And these are the mainstays of rich and meaningful social interaction. And this is what people are referring to when they try and articulate why mediated interaction is worse than face-to-face interaction. You can't hug another person. You can't pat them on the back or shake their hand. You're not even sharing the same physical environment, which might lead to greater cohesion or greater group understanding. And people tend to instinctively rank technologies according to the level to which they filter out these cues. So we get face-to-face is the best. Speaking on the telephone is the next best. Writing letters, maybe after that. The internet, where we don't even see things like handwriting or you know, the personal way that someone folded paper and things like that, is often considered the least representative of social co-presence. And so as online instructors, we have a lot that we really need to try and overcome here. For a composition class, this becomes especially serious for a lot of reasons. Composition instructors, as you all know, are much more like coaches than teachers. We are encouraging and supporting the practice of a skill that takes time and effort. I always like to tell my composition students to think of me as a basketball instructor. You know, they're just as if we were all trying to make a layup. We all have entered the class with varying levels of ability. We're all going to come out of the class with much increased talent at making a layup, but I can't just tell them how to play basketball better and then have them go do it. We're going to have to play basketball every day. And that level of coaching that comes into the skill of writing really requires a close connection and engagement with students. In composition classes, of course, the subject matter is often very personal, whether it's a creative writing course or a memoir course or even an academic persuasive writing where they're putting their opinions out there to be judged by others. That, of course, is the type of assignment that in negative situations leads the most to flaming. And of course, in a composition class, we want our students to be engaged and interactive with each other. That's a mainstay of the way that we teach writing is workshopping and peer review. And we need our students to perceive each other as legitimate individuals with a genuine sense of co-presence. So I want to talk now about the ways that we can overcome this lack of social cues in mediated interaction and cultivate a greater sense of co-presence. Now, one of the most straightforward ways to do this is through the use of rich media. And rich media can be audio or video. It can also be mixed media. But what this does, of course, is bring back in a lot of those social cues like facial expression and tone and attitude and posture and appearance and stuff like that. The downside, of course, is that full video lectures are not for everyone. Not everyone has the technology to do it professionally, and not everyone wants to. I tried exactly once to make a video lecture as a welcome message for my students, and it was one of the more mortifying experiences of my life. I looked like a 15-year-old girl on YouTube making a webcam show in her bedroom. It was just terrible. But there are a variety of other options available, and what I ended up doing for my welcome message for my class was overlaying an audio recording of me explaining how the classroom works onto a slideshow with a picture of me, pictures of our campus, screenshots of the online classroom, stuff like that. So rather than having to reconceptualize an online class as a professional grade television show in order to incorporate more social cues, we can simply try and cultivate rich media moments. And the thing to keep in mind here is that even very minimal rich media moments can add depth to the rest of the material in a classroom. Think about it this way. When you get a letter or an email from a close friend and you're reading through what they've written to you, you can picture him or her saying the words that they've written. You can imagine their tone or picture them as they would look if they were saying this to you in person. And this is something that humans as social creatures do instinctively. We use memories of embodied co-presence to fill in and enrich situations where our social cues are necessarily more limited. When we talk on the phone with someone, we picture how they would look if we know them well, when they were saying these things to us. So your students have the ability to do the same thing. They can take a very brief exposure to your voice or your image or your personality as an instructor that can really set the tone for the course and overlay that memory onto the less expressive communications that they receive. So extensive rich media is really not necessary. One thing that's really important, though, and I almost feel I can't emphasize this enough, and it almost goes against what some people think when they think about incorporating technology into a classroom, is to allow your genuine voice and personality to come through in these rich media moments. The goal should not be to create a professional training video. It should be to introduce yourself as a genuine human being. And this is also true, especially true, in fact, in online classrooms that are heavily textual, that rely mainly on written lectures, written discussions, and written assignments. Even if we have formal modes of speaking in our lectures, we need to also show ourselves as people, friendly people who are there to get to know and work with and help our students. The thing to remember, of course, is that when we teach in a face-to-face classroom, in a physical classroom, we don't only use one voice or one mode of interacting. We move between several distinct modes of interaction: formal lecturing, casual in-class discussion, group work, and even non-course related friendly conversation before and after class. And this really is where most online classes fall apart as engaging social communities. And the use of rich media is not enough here to overcome this, because moments of rich media, for the most part, aren't interactive. They're passive. So you can present yourself to your students in a pre-recorded video, which absolutely gives them that sense of co-presence that they can use and overlay on future text-based interaction, but you can't react to them, and you can't see their reactions to you. Since most online classes are asynchronous and therefore text-based in their interactive elements, and what I mean is that you're not conducting a live webcast with your students. Usually some people certainly are, and that's an incredible benefit to that communication of social cues. But for those of us teaching asynchronous text-based classes, my next main suggestion really addresses that kind of experience, and that is to learn to embrace chat norms. Now, this is a difficult one for a lot of instructors who, quite understandably, can't quite imagine maintaining authority while writing things like LOL or making smiley faces out of punctuation marks. But again, as a reminder, in a face-to-face class, we are able to retain authority during lectures, even if we're chatting with students about how their weekends were before class begins. It's an easy assumption to make that using typed slang is juvenile. But there are 2 points to consider here. One is that we tend to associate typewritten slang with young people because younger people simply adapted the technology to their needs faster than older people did. They made it more expressively useful in order to suit their social communication needs. So rather than seeing typed casual voice as juvenile, we need to recast it as expressively useful, a way to embody voice in our text. And the second point to consider is that there's no need to equate a casual written voice with grammatically atrocious, incomprehensible cell phone lingo. We want to strive for coherent casualness. That is our goal here. We all know, and in fact, we teach our students in composition classes that people use different voices in different rhetorical situations. We speak casually with our friends or formally to an employer. It extends as far as there being some people who, when they are at home with their families, have an accent and no accent in the classroom, or a different language in one context, even a literal different language. And typed communication should be the same if we want it to stand in for person-to-person communication. It's easy to see that we would email our friends differently than we would email our employers, just as we would speak differently to those two different groups of people. So the idea here is to utilize this idea of expressing voice through text in our classrooms to create the opportunity for a variety of rhetorical situations and employ our variety of voices accordingly. So certainly in written lectures, if you are presenting your students with a written lecture or lecture notes every week, language would be formal, correct, grammatically precise. But in the discussion forums where students are posting ideas for paper topics, maybe sharing their previous experience with writing, taking the time to respond with a really brief or simple, "That sounds great," or "How cool, where did you learn about that?" That is one of the best ways to indicate social presence. It shows the students that you are there with them as a person, not just as a formal resource of information. Now, one of the hardest aspects of teaching online for an instructor is the incredible amount of time that it takes to respond to student posts. If any of you have taught online, I'm sure you know about this experience. In a physical classroom, an instructor can listen all at once to several students' comments and can nod or indicate or agreement or interest with gestures and posture, and at the end say something like, "Great points, everyone, you're really getting the idea here." And that's the response that's encouraging and useful to everyone. In an online classroom, a text-based asynchronous discussion forum, group responses tend to feel really impersonal. And individual replies, taking the time to respond to each student individually, becomes really time-consuming and tedious, especially when not every post needs a response, but once you've responded to half of them, it seems to really glare at you that there's that other half you didn't respond to. Unfortunately, unresponsive instructors are a major common complaint from online students. But this is where that use of multiple voices and bringing in that casual text voice can really come in handy. Learning to utilize the typed equivalent of a nod or an expression of agreement saves a ton of time but still cultivates your presence in the classroom and frees you up to really use in-depth, more formal, more complete language in other environments. The other thing that this low level of interaction does is, one, it models for students ways for them to reply to and encourage each other. Once my students can see that I'm open to casual, "Hey, that's great, how neat, I've never heard of that before," sort of replies, they start doing it to each other. It models the type of interaction that you're expecting in the different areas of your classroom. And more importantly, it really discourages flaming because it fills that void of social cues. It asserts the co-presence of all of the members in the class, and people are much more likely to perceive each other as unique individuals that deserve, of course, respect and consideration and attention. Whoops, I'm going backwards now. Here we are. Okay, so in summary, I have been talking long enough. I want to know if people have questions, and we can move on. But I want to go over the main points that I have made here today. The first, of course, is that mediated interaction, as interaction is in online classroom, worries a lot of people because it filters out the social cues that are necessary for comprehension and engagement on a really rich level. Some basic principles of classroom design, things such as labeling instances of repetition and funneling students' attention in the right direction, can help provide students with social cues that they're missing out on as they explore their virtual classrooms. The use of rich media, even in the briefest of moments, can provide the intimacy and the immediacy that students can use to overlay onto the less rich interaction and communication. And then finally, the purposeful utilization of a variety of voices during typed communication can really help students perceive themselves as part of a genuine classroom culture. It helps create that sense of co-presence and really make a genuine social situation out of your classroom. So, you know, bringing it all back around, we no longer have students bowling alone. We have them bowling on a team. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to see what questions you have. Feel free to ask me about anything. I've enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you so much, Lynn, and we're glad to see that you have not been blown away. Hopefully the weather's improving rather than worsening in Florida. Mary Thompson has a question, which is, do you have any specific tips for developing a strong course organization and or social presence for online developmental writing courses?
You know, I think in this instance, as far as the organization goes, a lot of times we're constrained by whatever course management system we're using. And that's something that is so unique to individual situations that it wasn't something I necessarily included today. But depending on whether your university is using Blackboard or whatever the other options are these days, it provides you with certain elements that you can and cannot use. One thing that, for example, I've always thought would be really important, and my students have brought it up in suggestions, is the use of an avatar, some sort of visual marker that students can use to indicate themselves rather than their text-based name. But as far as I know, absolutely no course management software offers that. So we are limited in that sense with what we can put together. Other than that, I think personally, and I know it's a very basic level answer, but taking the elements that your course management system offers you and reducing them to the most minimal, not minimal usage, but minimal display is really what's required. That sense of students lacking the ability to look to each other to know what it is they're supposed to be paying attention to is a big deal. If you have a class of 20 students, that's 20 individual perceptions of what's going on in this classroom. And to be able to, what I like to do is give them a single point. It's every single time you log on, you go here, just this one place. If you need to go anywhere else, it's going to tell you in that one place. And of course, most course management software will let you link directly to other areas. And I think that once you've got that central focus, so that students know that really is that reduction of scatter. They know every time I log on, I go here, and I will know everything I need to know for this week. Once you have that sort of hub, then it becomes about creating a variety of interactive opportunities on a variety of different levels. So one space set aside for formalized peer review, one space set aside for casual and class discussion, and I think one space set aside for people to just post interesting stuff. I encourage my students to post funny YouTube videos that they find, emails that they get that are interesting, news reports that they want to talk about, and I try and model this for them, of course, by posting similar stuff as well, so that they're getting this opportunity to simply have fun, the way they would if they sat down in a class 10 minutes early and chatted with someone about the, what the campus newspaper had reported. So I think it's hard to be specific, but I think those elements are possible through any course management system.
Well, and I think a lot of your core principles that you're mentioning here about creating the central hub and labeling things clearly, including labeling paths, so keeping them moving down one consistent path, as well as labeling repetition, that all applies perhaps even more stringently in a developmental writing course as opposed to composition, where students are struggling more with traditional as well as digital literacies. So, and maybe even implementing more visual cues might enhance a developmental writing course. So
yeah, I think so, and I think really it really comes back to that idea of simplicity, and I think that we're seeing less, and this is my opinion, but we're seeing less of a distinction between traditional and digital media literacy. They seem to be sort of coming together, and I think that there's an idea that when we enter into this mediated level, it needs to become more complicated, and I don't think it does. I think exactly as you're saying, these principles are designed to create a sense of flow that students can be following.
Right. We probably have time for one more. Angie Carter is wondering how this looks like what you're talking about is more of a distance learning course than a hybrid course, and she's wondering how you adapt the models that you've presented here for a hybrid course.
That is a really excellent question, and I think the main distinction that we have is that in a hybrid course, we have that opportunity for the memories of embodied co-presence to be created in the physical classroom and then brought to bear on the online classroom. And so what I think there is the most beneficial is to provide those additional opportunities. I mean, there are things you can do in an online classroom that you can't do in a physical classroom. So have those opportunities, but really eliminate all the unnecessary redundancies. In a hybrid course, the physical classroom, for the most part, becomes that central hub. I mean, there's still going to be the need for background information that can be available certainly far beyond the time spent in the physical classroom in the online classroom, but as far as the metered information that's coming out, students should be able to know where they're going for that. One of the complaints that I got about hybrid classes was when it's almost like taking two separate courses when half the information is given in the physical class and half is given online, rather than the online classroom serving to complement or to build off of the information given in the physical classroom. So my overall advice for both a hybrid classroom and an entirely distance classroom is to always keep it as simple as the situation allows, to make it as straightforward as possible. And that doesn't mean basic or uninteresting or using non-rich media. I'm simply, talking about the way that students navigate, making it as simple as possible. And in a hybrid course, you have even more opportunity for that because you do have that additional central hub of physical presence.
And, there's kind of a related question here from Brian Powell wondering about the 8-week online course, and I suspect your answer is probably somewhat similar about focus and redundancy, but he's wondering, do you have experience with an 8-week online course, and what do you think of that? Do you feel like there are ways to avoid shortchanging the students on in-depth learning and mastery?
Yeah, I've taught an 8-week online course, and I will say I didn't love it. There wasn't really, I feel that the time it takes for students to really get with the program in an online course and figure out, oh, okay, this is what's being expected of me, this is how this is going to work. The course is half over. Excuse me, by the time that's happened, I think what I ended up doing really was, I'm hoping it's not shortchanging the students, but the repetition was ramped up a notch and the complexity was toned down a notch. So every single time the students heard from me, there was almost, I could have copied and pasted, at the end, it was, we are moving incredibly fast. Do not wait to ask your questions. If you're confused now, you're going to be more confused later. Figure it out now. I mean, really just a constant bombardment of, you don't have the leisure time to get with the program here. And, trying to mix that with, I'm available, responsive, friendly. One of the things I do is, rather than using in course management system chat, I use AOL Instant Messenger so that students, they often use it from their cell phones. They can access me. That I have formal office hours where I'm guaranteed to be there, but the rest of the time they're welcome to try me. I have not just a separate office phone, but a separate office cell phone that I use for my students, because a lot of them, for better or for worse, are very comfortable texting where they don't want to call me. So I get a lot of text messages from students asking me to clarify something real quick about an assignment. I would much rather text them back and get them the answer than not have them ask at all. And so I think that kind of giving them just unlimited avenues to access me and access this interaction that we can have is really helpful. But then when they enter the classroom, it needs to be even more straightforward than normal because they just do not have the time to parse through all of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Lynn, we're pretty much out of time, but a lot of people are asking if you would mind sharing your email address. There are a lot of people that would probably like to see like a sample syllabus or to get your advice on the grading policies and rubrics.
Absolutely.
And so we've had a lot of questions like that, so go ahead.
Okay, yes, my email address is Lynne, L-Y-N-N-E, .McNeill, M-C-N-E-I-L-L, at usu.edu. And you can also find that by going to Utah State University's website. If you go to the English department, I'm listed under there, or if you go to the Folklore program, I'm listed under there as a faculty member as well, and you'll be able to find that information there.
Lynn, thank you so much. This was really helpful. I know for not just for me, but for a lot of people, that these are great ideas and great practice, best practices. So thanks so much for your time, and I hope the rest of your day is good.
Thanks for having me, Amy. I appreciate it.
All righty. Bye now.
Bye.
We'll be starting our next session at 1 o'clock Eastern Time, Multilingual Writing Students, Opportunities and Challenges, with Kate Mangelsdorf and Evelyn.